Ah, he's a man, all right. Okay, so just want to get you back to our bearings here, the big picture of what we're doing this week. So we got through two, out of 16 or whatever, but we're getting started. That's good. We're revving up. And so today we'll probably do 3. Woo! Yeah. All right, so we'll try to do these 3, 4, and 5 today, and that'll get us well set up for next time. So let us turn then to a problem. Yeah. Let's face it. Face the problem, man. Okay. So let me tell you about my nephew. My nephew grew up in my brother's home. I guess that would go without saying. And he grew up as a Christian, went to college, kind of underwent some of the trials that people often do at that age, and to a large degree at least seems to have turned away from his faith that he had as a child. And I remember one time he told me, he said, as I grew up, I finally came to understand that these stories we tell from the Bible and stories we tell about Jesus, etc., they're like Santa Claus stories. They are stories that we tell that have a certain purpose, and there's a function for parents and families to have that, and I get all that, but now I'm grown up and I don't need Santa Claus stories anymore. Well, my nephew's on to something, isn't he? My nephew is on to a very, very, most people wouldn't articulate it so clearly, but I think they're on to a fairly common way of thinking. And that is that, look, we tell Jesus stories, we tell Buddha stories, we tell ancient mythology, we tell all these stories. What's to make us think that any one of these stories has any more credibility than any of the others? And the way most of us read the Bible, the way most of you read the Bible before you came to DBS, you kind of operated on that assumption, didn't you? You weren't maybe thinking about it, but it's just a bunch of stories. Useful stories, interesting stories, maybe divine, authoritative stories, but no particular reason to think that these stories had anything more to do with real life than any other set of stories. And I think he's right. I think that as Christians, often we talk about the Bible in just such a way to give such an impression, and so it makes sense. Very interestingly, he has a good friend who is a he's the son of one of the Saudi princes. So he's a Muslim, higher up, super elite dude, really, really smart guy involved in foreign diplomacy. And he's a good friend of my nephew. And they decided to go to the Middle East together, and they traveled around, and they went to Israel. And so my nephew, wisely I hope, said, hey, I'm going to Israel, what should I visit? And so I pointed to him to a lot of the things I will show you, and said, go visit those things, and let's talk about those Santa Claus stories when you get back. And of course, you can't go to Israel and go visit those places and come back thinking these are Santa Claus stories. Because there is something different. I study pretty much all religions, okay? And I deal with all kinds of different ancient, I teach a course in ancient mythology and so on. And I can tell you this, that for the most part, religious literature is kind of like my nephew said. That is, it is a bunch of stories that for the most part have nothing to do with this earth. They're stories that take place in mythological space and time, in the heavens or in the distant past or something. And the people who hold to those particular religious traditions or whatever, they understand that. They understand that these are stories with a moral point, with a spiritual lesson or whatever, but they don't really have anything to do with workaday human existence. There are some exceptions. There are stories about Muhammad, obviously, that are about the real Muhammad, etc. But many of these stories are of that nature. there's something different when you start to study the Bible. And one of the things I hope that you'll get a handle on during our period of time together is that the Bible goes out of its way to do some very strange things that tie it to the ground, that tie it to the workaday reality of normal human beings instead of placing the stories in mythological space and time. Even so much as, think about it, what is the great story for the Hebrews? The great story is the story of the patriarchs, slavery, and Exodus from slavery, right? Isn't that the great story of the Hebrews? Yeah. Well, that story, why would you make up a story? If you're going to tell mythological space-time stories about yourself, you're going to tell heroic stories, aren't you? You're going to tell the good. That's what everybody does in the ancient world. What do the Hebrews do? They talk about themselves like they're a bunch of idiots, right? We're a bunch of slaves. We got out from slavery. God helped us get out from slavery. And then as soon as we got there, we forgot about God and we went back to the other gods. Amen. Nobody makes up that kind of stuff. Okay, these are stories rooted in real times and places with all the real foibles of humanity wrapped in. And because of that, precisely because of that, we can talk about those places where these stories touch the earth in tangible ways. We've already seen a few of these, right? We've seen inscriptions by other kings. So we have a king that's mentioned in the Bible, and we have that king's palace. And we have inscriptions by that king. And oh, by the way, that king talks about the Hebrews, right? And so we have these touch points all over the place where the Bible touches the ground in ways that we can see and, in many cases, touch, right? And try to think through. Another big set of stories that the Hebrews tell is the stories about the formation of their own monarchy. And you've got the united monarchy, you've got Saul, David, Solomon, and then you have the divided monarchy, and that's what we're dealing with during this period. The evidence that we have available to us during the period of the divided kingdom, we have a whole bunch, and I'll show you a whole bunch of different touch points. Anybody who's an archaeologist, no matter what their religious perspective is, and by the way, I work with atheist archaeologists, mostly with Jewish archaeologists, very few Christians actually, but I work with people from all kinds of different, but they all agree these are, there's no denying these particular discoveries and their connection to the Bible, and there's nobody wants to deny. Those are very interesting, those connections. But what about those early kings, especially David and Solomon? Because David has this character, doesn't he? He kind of looms over the text in different places. And other kings are sort of compared to him. You're going to really see this in Chronicles. So David is sort of this heroic king, this image of what a king ought to be, in a sense. Although you know better now, right? You've read your books of Samuel, so you know that actually there's a lot of dirt on David in Samuel, right? I mean, the book there is not even shy about exposing the skeletons in the closet of one of their greatest kings. But nevertheless, you can understand how some people might think that this David is maybe a mythological character, that he's too grand, he's too big, he's too heroic. Was there a historical David? Maybe. Was David as big and powerful and heroic as the biblical text makes him out to be? Have your doubts, because it sounds awfully heroic, like a lot of other heroic mythological literature. Because of this way of thinking, there has developed a great debate among scholars. They call it the problem of the 10th century. Okay, so we're going to deal with the problem directly with the problem of the 10th century today. And the problem of the 10th century boils down to, does the portrait of David and Solomon as these big and powerful kings, does that square with what we find on the ground, or is there some sort of disconnect? Are they more mythological figures who are exaggerated or maybe even created for a particular effect? Okay? That's the kind of argument that people have about the problem of the 10th century. Now let me raise one other issue about the 10th century, and then we can dive into the evidence. in terms of archaeology, one of the things that archaeologists are really interested in is what we call monumental architecture. Monumental architecture. That's a big fancy word for saying building big stuff, right? Building like pyramids, right? Pyramids are cool. You know, great tombs, these are cool. But they're cool because they're big. They're cool because their bigness sets them apart from other kinds of architecture that you find on the ground. So, and the thing with monumental architecture is that the existence of it points to a power behind it. Somebody had to be able to pull this off. I didn't tell you the story, but the first time I ended up speaking here for the University of the Nations in 2002 was because of a research project that I haven't finished yet. Someday I will finish it. Examining the archaeology of ancient Hawaiian temples, pre-Hawaiian temples that were built before Westerners came, as a way of trying to understand what was the religion like that was here before the first missionaries came and encountered it and started to deal with it. You may not know, if you pay attention to the area, you might pay attention, but go over to King K Hotel over there, you know, the little lagoon, and if you go look out where the luau is, and you'll see that grass-thatched, kind of large grass-thatched building on a platform sticking out into the water. That's an ancient Hawaiian temple, okay? That's called a heiau. And that was actually one of the personal ones for King Kamehameha himself. He lived there on that property, and this was a personal shrine of his. And if you go up and down this coast, actually, there are dozens of them. All the way up to, if you go to Kauai, you can see the Pu'ukohola, the great big one overlooking the bay there. That's actually two big ones there. If you go down to Children's Beach down here, just on this side of it where the surf break is, there's a heiau there that's in honor of the surf god. I kind of like that one. I have an aerial picture of it, of the heiau with some surfers next to it. I thought that was just particularly good. You know the City of Refuge down south, right? This whole area that they're doing with the outrigger that they're tearing down and redoing. I haven't gone down there this time to see how far they've gotten. But all of that is because there's a whole bunch of monumental architecture there, these Hawaiian temples. One other interesting piece of the puzzle, this is from a Christian point of view. First missionaries who came, you know this? First missionaries who came, the first missionary company came first here, Kailua. And they landed right there in the bay. And the very first church built in Hawaii was right down there. Mokuakawa Church is the very first church that was built in Hawaii. If you look carefully at that church, you'll notice that it's kind of a strange construction. It's got the black basalt stones like we have here with cement mortar around them. Those stones were the stones of a heiau that was in that place. So an ancient Hawaiian temple that was there. The missionaries came in, and the very first church they built, they took those stones, which, by the way, the land and the stones themselves were considered sacred and filled with spiritual power, and they took them apart and they put them together again into the first church in Hawaii. Very interesting piece of missionary communication going on in that particular event. But all these temple sites, these are monumental architecture, which tells you that the kings who built those things were pretty powerful dudes. They were able to pull together the money and the people and the labor and the materials to be able to get them all to that time and place and work according to a design and make it happen. Okay? So monumental architecture is a nice thing you can find on the ground that points to a power behind it that is big and strong. So our question for the day, for the moment at least, is when do we first see monumental architecture in ancient Israel? That will tell us who is the first big king who's got that kind of power to be able to pull together monumental architecture. Does that make sense? Yes. You all with me? Yes. Okay. So, and the problem of the 10th century was it the 10th century? That is, the 10th century is David Solomon time. Did the Hebrew kings, do we have archaeological evidence that the Hebrew kings at that period of time had that kind of power and resources to be able to make big stuff? If they did, cool, because the Bible seems to speak that kind of language. If they didn't, we've got an issue, right? We've got a disconnect between what we find on the ground and what we find in the text. So the problem of the 10th century. So here is a rough chronology that most scholars will agree with. You can see, as you probably know, scholars debate the date of the Exodus, right? So there's kind of the early date and the late date. It's either about 1450 or about 1250, okay? It used to be about 50-50. Scholars are kind of divided over this. About half of them thought it was 1450, about half of them thought it was 12. By the way, it's not anywhere in between there. It's either one or the other. The recent archaeological evidence has started causing the vast majority of scholars starting to lean toward the later date now. It's not important for our purposes, but the Bible, different texts in the Bible point to both, so that's why there's this debate about the date. So we're not sure about that. In any case, it doesn't matter for our purposes. Whenever the Exodus was, then after that we have a period, either longer or shorter, of the conquest and the judges. And then we hit the period of the united monarchy. And these dates are pretty solid. We have lots of cross checks. So these dates of Saul, David, Solomon, they are 10th century, 900s BC. Okay? Then, of course, in 931 we have the divided monarchy. Then we have the Assyrian conquest and then the Babylonian captivity and the return under the Persians. Okay? So that's basically the chronology we went over yesterday. I just wanted to get you. So when we talk about the problem of the 10th century, we're talking about this, right? 999 down to 900 would be the 10th century. So basically this period, David, Solomon. Now, let me give you some sense of the debate. And by the way, I went to a whole conference devoted to this debate. So all the top archaeologists in the world were there fighting over this particular issue. So that was really fun. So you know now about monumental architecture. The traditional view is by a guy named Albright. And Albright argued that the first monumental architecture we see in Israel, especially city gate complexes, which I will show you in a minute, these date from the 10th century, and therefore they support pretty well the biblical stories of David and Solomon, which talked about many of their building projects, including, of course, the temple, which would be a big monumental architecture project under Solomon. That's Albright's view. About, let's say, 20 years ago, there developed a camp of scholars, largely centered in Denmark, but there's a number of them around the world, not that many, but a number of them. They're called biblical minimalists. And the biblical minimalists basically argue for the latest possible date for the creation of the biblical texts, and argue that these David Solomon stories in the Bible are really founder myths, and they have nothing to do with reality on the ground. And therefore any attempt to connect them with archaeology is misled, and it's not worth our effort. And, oh, by the way, our earliest monumental architecture really dates from the 9th century and not the 10th century, so it doesn't fit them anyhow. That's what the biblical minimalists argue. Now, for the most part, the biblical minimalists have been discredited. That is, many scholars from many different fields have shown that A, they're not terribly good biblical scholars, and B, they're crappy archaeologists. But besides that, they're great. But along comes Israel Finkelstein. Isn't that a great name? Israel. And he looks like his name. He's a big, tall guy with a beautiful, that Israeli accent with a deep voice, and he's got this regal sort of stand. He's cool. And he's also a really good writer. And Israel Finkelstein, who happens to be one of the greatest of Israeli archaeologists, and Israel has some of the greatest archaeologists in the world, Israel Finkelstein came along and argued that he says the biblical minimalists are off base in many ways, but they get certain things right, especially the chronology of the period, because we've been reading the evidence on the ground wrong, says Finkelstein. And when Finkelstein says that, you better take him seriously because he's a great archaeologist. So, Finkelstein kind of sets our agenda for today because he argues that the earliest monumental architecture in Israel dates from the 9th century and not the 10th century. And therefore, if there was a historical David and Solomon, they did not have nearly the power and resources that the Bible makes them out to have. Okay? That's Finkelstein. By the way, like many Israeli intellectuals, Finkelstein is not a religious Jew. He's what you call a secular Jew. religiously speaking. He's not, in fact, he really doesn't care about the biblical text very much at all, except as it helps him do his archaeology. He's an archaeologist, and he's a great one. Now, Finkelstein, his questions and the issues he raised for us several other questions. In what sense are the biblical accounts historical? How can we know the dates of certain structures? What pottery, remember pottery dating is important, what pottery represents the 10th century? How are the remains of various tells related to each other? What is the archaeological record of the 10th century, and what does this reveal about the historical David and Solomon? So these are the kinds of questions that swirl around the problem of the 10th century. Now remember I told you that archaeologists pay attention to material culture, trash if you will, and we pay attention primarily to the metals, the materials people use to make weapons and tools and so on. And so you can see you have Bronze and Iron Age, and then Iron 1 is that first period when the Hebrews come in to the land, and then Iron 2A is the period we're talking about. So basically about David's time, remember, by the way, nice round date, David 1000, right? Very probably David was king in 1000 BC, so that's a nice round number to work from. So roughly from the time of David down until the northern kingdom is destroyed by the Assyrians, that period is Iron 2A. So that's what we're most interested in. Okay, now get our bearings on the map. We're going to pay attention to several archaeological sites. Okay, we're going to pay attention to Dan, way up at the top, tell Dan, Chatzor. You don't say Hazor, it looks like Hazor. Chatzor, can you say it? You got it. Chatzor. All right, yeah. You know, get really close to your neighbor and say, no, don't. Here's Megiddo, we'll pay attention to that, and of course, Jerusalem. By the way, this is relatively new archaeological evidence, about 10 years old. This map is really important. See those blue dots? Okay, so I told you recent archaeological evidence has pointed more people toward a later date of the Exodus. Here's why. And by the way, a lot of I've seen so much and heard so much, like movies and television shows and popular literature and so on about trying to relate archaeology to the Exodus, and it's almost all complete nonsense. Okay, so let me just think for a minute. I mean, it's funny because archaeology is so ridiculously basic that you have to think in really basic terms. Think about it. Exodus. What is Exodus? It's people leaving, right? And they're wandering around. So what do you see on the ground when people leave and wander around? Let's have everybody leave this campus and wander around town. What will you see on the ground? Nothing, right? Yeah, maybe they'll leave some trash along, maybe they'll leave some footprints. But I mean, that's going to last thousands of years for archaeologists to dig up. There's nothing. So you would not expect to find any archaeological evidence of the Exodus. It's not like they ran around and, oh, we'll build a city here for 3 days and then we'll move somewhere else. They don't do that, right? They just move around and they're camping. They're using hides and wood and basic things to cover themselves, right? So all the stuff is going to decompose and it's not going to leave anything behind. So because of this, where's the real Mount Sinai? Where did they cross the Red Sea? What was the Red Sea? By the way, it's not the Red Sea. You probably know that. It's the Sea of Reeds, Yam Suf in Hebrew, which, by the way, Sea of Reeds? Sea of Reeds? Reeds grow in fresh water. Pay attention to that. Anyhow, there's a lot of stuff about this. So these television specials and things that come out that try to give you evidence for the Exodus, just be very wary of that stuff because you just wouldn't expect to see anything. What would you expect to see? What you would expect to see is not evidence of people leaving and not evidence of people wandering and not evidence of people crossing water, but what you would expect to see is people arriving. Yeah? Because when they arrive, that's when they're going to build and set up new places. So where do you see evidence of a significant population influx into Israel? That's an archaeological question. And there's the answer. What happened was, think about it, if you are a whole bunch of refugees, right, and you are coming into a new area, where are you going to move? You are not going to be able to go to the places that people already control. So where's the good land? The good land is already taken. The good land's along the coast. The good land is along the Jordan River. That's already taken. So you're going to follow, by and large, the path of least resistance. So where do they go? They go to the hill country in between, north of Jerusalem, kind of Samaria area. The crappy land, right? The land that nobody else wanted before. In that area, before 1200 BC, there were only a handful of villages in that hill country. And all of a sudden, in a short, maybe about 50-year period, 139 new towns show up in the highlands of Israel. What just happened? Population influx, right? And the date's pretty solid, around 1200 BC. That's the best evidence we have, folks. So pay attention to the chicken pox. It's helpful. By the way, this is done by a friend of mine, Adam Zertal, an Israeli archaeologist, who did the survey archaeology. Survey archaeology, you don't actually dig. You go around and you look at what's on the surface and you see what remains from a different period. And these are all Iron Age sites, new Iron Age sites launched about 1200 BC. So that's a nice piece of evidence that you can see. There's one other piece of evidence I'll show you in a little while. Now, one of the things that's going to be really helpful to us is this guy, Shishak attack. So this is actually his temple in Karnak, down in southern Egypt. I was just there at Christmas and got to see this. So there he is. And these are Egyptian hieroglyphics. And right here in the Egyptian he talks about, and by the way, this is standard stuff. All over the place in the ancient world, you have kings put up monuments. And in the monuments, it tells about all their conquests, right? All the people that they beat up. So all these hieroglyphics around here, these are all a bunch of people that Shoshank beat up, including, he says, Arad, Gibeon, and Megiddo. Okay? 2 Chronicles talks about him coming in and saying, I took the fortified cities of Judah. Okay, so we have a connection here, a very nice connection between the Bible and this inscription by Shoshank, and a recent archaeological discovery at Megiddo right here. This is kind of looks like a gravestone. We call it a stela that was inscribed in hieroglyphics. You can see it there. And this is King Shoshank bragging that I have come here to Megiddo and I conquered. Okay, this is a Shishak was here inscription. Okay, so nice connection there. By the way, look at the date, 925, 926. We have a really solid date on this, and because of that, if you can see the burn layer from the Shishak attack, that helps you date what's above and below. And by the way, 925, 10th century. So what you really want to find now is stuff sitting right on top or right below the Shishak attack. That'll get you your evidence of the 10th century. That make sense? Yeah. You all with me? Yeah. Okay. A couple other big things that you can see kind of when you look at the archaeology as a whole of Israel, you can see a lot of Egyptian influence down to about 1100 BC, and then it starts to pull out. So you stop finding Egyptian stuff. Then you have the Shishak attack. Then remember, Tiglath-Pileser III, a couple hundred years later, his major attacks in the north, a lot of burn layers there. I already showed you one of them. Shalmaneser V when he takes out Samaria. And then Sennacherib's siege of Jerusalem and Lachish in 701. So those things we should expect to see on the ground at certain places. If we can identify that event, then that helps us date what's around it. All right, now, here is the monumental architecture. So, and let's look at Hatzor because it's the easiest one to see. Okay, this is a city gate complex. So think about it. If you know that the Assyrians are a threat, and they commonly will attack walled cities. We saw those pictures, right? They're going to attack walled cities, and they have broomsticks with them. What do you want to do? Protect your city, right? Make sure, run maybe. But protect your city. So make sure your walls are good and strong. But the problem is, of course, you can wall up your city very well and starve to death. You have to be able to get in and out. You have to be able to get to the agricultural fields. You have to have a couple other things. You have to be able to store water. You have to be able to store food. Those things we'll talk about later. For now, we want to talk about the place you go in and out, the city gate. Here are city gates. And let me try to explain the architecture here and what's going on with them. So look at Hatzor, you can see it from the air, and you can see here the city wall. It's a double wall here. We call this a casamate wall, double wall going off this way. Can you see that? And then here's the city gate, here's Main Street going in and out. For you guys over here. Okay, double wall, city wall. Then here's Main Street going in and out, and this is the gate complex. Here's a drawing of it, and this is what it looks like from the air. You all with me? Yes. Okay. Now, here's the deal. Here's why they did this kind of construction. If your enemy's going to attack you, they are probably going to attack your city gate because that's your weak point. So somehow you got to make your weak point strong, but you still got to let people go in and out. So, number one, you want to narrow. Any attacking army hates to do two things. They hate to turn, and they hate to get narrowed down. Right? So you want to make them do the stuff they don't want to do. Because as soon as an army has to turn, they're vulnerable. They don't have good defenses. Oh, by the way, you also want to be above them so you can throw stuff down on them. Then you want to make them narrow down as much as possible so they cannot use the advantage of their numbers when they attack you. Simple enough? Yes. So what you do is you create a fairly narrow main street. So the street to go in and out is only about 10 feet wide, 12 feet wide. Okay, 4 meters. So, in other words, when the army attacks, they can only come in 2 people at a time. Pretty much. You've narrowed them down that much. When they come in and now they want to attack you, what you have is you have your door right here. Wooden doors that close. So you've made them turn out here because there's an external gate that makes them turn. And then they come in and they hit your door. When they hit your door, in order to attack your door with a battering ram, they have to stand in between 2 towers. When they're battering away on your door, you're standing above them, 2 towers, and what are you doing? You're throwing stuff down on them, right? Rocks and, I don't know what, pots and hot oil. Ooh, that'd be a good one. Or like cattle. You know, small children, whatever you want to throw down on them, misbehaving mother-in-laws, anyhow, whatever it is. Oh, that's terrible. That's terrible. Okay, so you see, so we have tower, and this is where the door is. And this is Main Street coming in. This is inside the city, this is outside the city. You all with me? Okay. Now, let's assume for a moment that this is a very determined enemy. You know the Assyrians are good at this stuff. And they're able to knock down your door. They can burn it down, they can pound it down, and they come in and attack your city. Now what? Now you've got them narrowed down, and they have to attack 2 by 2. As they come in, you have these rooms. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We call these gate chambers. You see them? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Right now, in the current state of preservation, they're walled in, but in time of war, the inside of these up against the street would be opened up, okay? And what you do is you pack soldiers in these chambers. You can pack about 10 soldiers in each one of the chambers. So that way, when these guys attack and they knock down your door, the very first thing they're greeted with is a battle, 2 on 20. Right? They get 10 guys attacking from the right, 10 guys attacking from the left, 2 on 20. And if they get by that battle, they hit the next 2 chambers, and they get to do 2 on 20 again. And then if they get by that, they get to do it again before they ever get into your city. Not bad, huh? This is what we call a 6-chamber gate. A 6-chamber gate. And this is big. This is monumental architecture. It takes a lot of coordination to build this structure. And not only to build this structure, but take a look at the 3 drawings. They are all almost on precisely the same architectural plan, even using the same measurements. There's only small differences that have to do with the shape of the hill they live on. Okay? In other words, there is nothing else like these 6-chamber gates, and these 6-chamber gates all have the same measurements. That is very strong evidence that you have a single architect, a single mastermind behind the project at all 3 places, and these are 3 of the key strategic positions in Israel because of where they are. Megiddo controls an important pass going from the hill country out to the sea and the whole plain of Megiddo. Chatzor controls the north. Gezer controls the Shephelah, the foothills leading up to Jerusalem. Okay, so if you're a king, you want these three places to be strong because these are your 3 points of vulnerability. So this is what we actually see on the ground. And our question then, since these are monumental architecture, is when were they built? Are these 10th century or 9th century? Well, the Bible actually talks about these places. 1 Kings 9:15 says Solomon built the Lord's temple, that's monumental architecture. His own palace, that's monumental architecture, but we don't have either of those. The Millo, whatever the heck that is, the wall of Jerusalem, and then Chatzor, Gezer, and Megiddo. Precisely those three towns that I just showed you. He built those places up as well as towns for his chariots and his horses, which seem to imply that those towns are also for chariots and horses. So, wow, that's an awfully good connection. The biblical text saying Solomon did monumental architecture. David, by the way, built a palace before him, so he also did monumental architecture. And specifically, these three sites. Albright said yes. And in fact, those three city gates date to the 10th century. They fit with Solomon. This is exactly what it's talking about. Solomon had the capacity to do monumental architecture. Amen. That's Albright. But remember, Finkelstein is saying, no, these gates date from the 9th century. They're 100 years later. So who's right? One of the keys to our understanding of this is the distinction between red slipped hand-burnished pottery and red slipped wheel-burnished pottery. Aren't you thrilled to know that? So here's an example of the two. You can tell on this picture on the left that, so if you make a piece of pottery and you want to make it kind of shiny, and there's no such thing as glaze in this period, what you do is you fire your pot. Anybody done pottery? All right, if you've done pottery, you know what I'm talking about. You fire your pot. And do you know about terra sigillata? Terra sigillata is, well, basically, you can make a slip. Okay, so take some clay, mix it in water real thin. So after you fire your pot, then put a second layer of clay on it with this real thin, just mush it on, right? And then fire it again. And that'll fill all the pores and that kind of stuff. And then, when you get done, center your pot back on a wheel and take a stone, smooth stone, and rub it. If you rub it over that clay slip that's been fired the second time, it'll get shiny. And you can see, look, see the stripes from somebody rubbing it? And notice this is that's burnishing. That's hand burnished because, see the lines aren't straight? They're kind of crooked. That's hand burnished pottery. Somebody figured out, oh, you can do this on a wheel, right? Put a clump of clay, center the pot on the wheel, and now get it spinning and take your stone and just hold it against the pot as it spins, and you get nice clean lines around it. That's wheel burnished pottery. So probably people did hand burnishing before they did wheel burnishing, if that makes sense. And so probably the hand burnished pottery is older and the wheel burnished pottery is newer, right? So the dating of this distinction between hand burnished and wheel burnished is kind of key because it happened somewhere in the 10th century. Maybe. All right, here's another hand burnished piece. All right, first let's go to Tel Megiddo. You've already seen this tell. This is where Finkelstein is the director. Okay, so he's the Megiddo man. And you remember where Megiddo is here? It controls this pass coming out from the plain of Megiddo out into the coastal plain. Now here's the key. Finkelstein also excavated not only Megiddo, but nearby he excavated Jezreel. Does Jezreel ring any bells? What's Jezreel? That's where Ahab and Jezebel built a palace for themselves. And remember that horrible scene when Jezebel comes flying out the window and the dogs are that's Jezreel. Okay? So they built the palace of Jezreel. Finkelstein excavated the palace at Jezreel, and on the left is the pottery he found there. On the right, is the pottery he found associated with the city gate at Megiddo. Do you see the problem? This is the heart of his argument. They're very, very similar, aren't they? They're almost the same. And because of that, Finkelstein argues the gate at Megiddo has to date from the same time as the palace at Jezreel. And who built it? Ahab, not Solomon, 100 years later. See that? That's a pretty good argument. Okay. So let's see how that argument holds up when we look at the other sites. Here is Hatzor, up in the north. Hatzor, beautiful archaeological site. And here you can see where Hatzor is. It controls the access from the north. They are Tel Dan and Hatzor are the two closest sites to Assyria, right? So, they're allergic to broomsticks. Here is the Amnon Ben Tor, the Israeli archaeologist, is the guy in charge of Hatzor. And here's his drawing of the site. And he said these green areas are 10th century. These orange areas are 9th century. And he says they have to be because of the stratigraphy, because of the nature of the layers and their relationship to each other. What does he mean? Well, before I go there, I promised you another piece of evidence. Hatzor, same place. See these pits, these holes? See what's inside? Dark black. That is ash. That is a major burn layer. What you are looking at is the area of the palace, the Canaanite palace that predates the Hebrews being there. The Canaanite palace was destroyed by a major fire, and you're seeing the evidence of that fire here. So this is before the Shishak attack. This fire dates from 1200 BC. Right about 1200, 1220, somewhere around there, 1200 BC. According to the book of Joshua, Yabin, king of Hatzor, created a coalition of 5 cities that attacked Joshua and the Hebrews. Joshua and the Hebrews defeated them, and the text specifically says in the book of Joshua, Joshua burned only one city, Hatzor. There you see a very nice burn layer right on top of the palace that would have been King Yabin's palace, the Canaanite palace that predated the Israelites. So there's a very nice, note the date, 1200, 1220 BC. Just at the same time that all those villages are being built up in the highlands. That also is a really good fit, isn't it? The problem is that there's other evidence that points more toward the 1450 date, so the debate will continue. But anyhow, I just wanted you to see those two pieces of evidence. Jericho, for example, the evidence seems to point to an earlier date. So we're not going to resolve this by archaeology, but at least this is the new evidence that's coming along that's tipping the scales a bit. All right, here is Hatzor. You see our gate. You see our double wall. Here is the whole complex. So you have the gate right over here. You have the double wall. You have this other structure. And then the Canaanite palace that was burned is underneath. You can see the layer, right? So here's a building, and then this stuff is built on top of it. Can you see that? So here, this is a Canaanite. This is before the Hebrews came. This stuff is built on top of it. You can see it's a layer higher, several layers higher, actually. Okay, and all this stuff is interlaced. When you build with stones, you don't butt them up against each other, right? You interweave them so they get stronger. So all the structures are interweaved, so it's all one construction project. That's why, well, here you can see all these pieces are hooked together. Here's some of the pottery they found in the foundation of the gate. By the way, so how do you date a building from pottery? Think about it. If you build a wall, even now, if you want to build a wall here, what do? First thing you do is you dig, right? You dig a trench. Not very deep, but you might want to dig a trench, depending on a lot of rock here, so you build maybe a shallow trench. But you dig a trench, and then you place your bottom stones very carefully in that trench, because those first few courses of stones got to be real stable or your wall's going to fall down. Then what you do, once you've got the first few courses of stones laid down, then you take the earth around it and you backfill the trench, and that dirt then keeps the whole bottom of your wall stable as you build it up. Does that make sense? We call that a foundation trench. So you just do the opposite when you do archaeology. You excavate down to the bottom of the wall, and the pottery that's right there on either side of the wall, down at the bottom, any broken pieces of pottery, the latest pottery that you find in the foundation trench dates the wall. Make sense? Yeah. Right? Because remember, the pottery is just garbage around, just a piece of, and you shove it in there, and so there you, so that's a really nice way that you can date a wall. Now, here is the key argument by Amnon Ben-Tor against Israel Finkelstein. So this is two great Israeli archaeologists fighting with each other. Basically, here's the traditional chronology that Amnon Ben-Tor says is correct. If this city gate was built in 950 BC by Solomon, it was destroyed in 732 BC by Tiglath-Pileser III. So there's a burn layer on the top of the whole thing. It was destroyed then. Everybody agrees with that. So in between, the life of the gate was from 950 down to 732. That is, it lasted for 220 years. But during that 220 years, when you look at the stratigraphy that's laid down, there are 6 complete strata in there, and then subsections, 11 to 12 of them. That means you have an average of only 35 years per layer. That is, a whole area was built, sat there, destroyed, and rebuilt all in 35 years. And you have to do that 6 times over in this 220 years. That's really fast. That's really fast. But if you agree with Israel Finkelstein, this gate was not built in 950. It was built in 880. If this gate was built in the 9th century, it's still destroyed at the same time. And all that stratigraphy has to happen in that same period, but now instead of having 220 years, you only have 150 years. That means you only get 25 years for each stratum, and that is unheard of. No archaeological sites have ever had strata develop that quickly. So, says Amnon Ben-Tor, there is simply not time for this to happen. This is what had to happen. It had to be Solomon. And nobody argues for an earlier date. So that's the latest possible date that even makes any sense of what's actually there on the ground. How about Gezer? Here is Gezer. William Deaver of the University of Michigan excavated there. And here is Gezer. You can see it's on the foothills on the way up to Jerusalem. What William Deaver found was that at the gate level, in the foundation of the gate, there was red, slipped, hand-burnished pottery. Then there was a destruction about 925. It was probably the Shishak attack. And then on top of that destruction layer, there was red, slipped, wheel-burnished pottery. So the wheel-burnished pottery is 9th century. The hand-burnished pottery is 10th century. The gate was built in the 10th century, says Deaver. Tel Rehov, a recent excavation, shows a very similar story to what we saw at Hatzor. It's such a recent excavation that I had to add it to the map. So here we have, it's up here, just south of the Sea of Galilee. You can see Tel Rehov, not far from Bet Shan. Tel Rehov is a really weird site. Here's an ancient high place at Tel Rehov. Here is a goddess worshipped there, Asherah. You've met her before. We'll meet her again. Here's some of the structures they found, including a really interesting find, wooden beams in the foundation of the building. I don't know if you know, but in areas that are highly earthquake prone, like here and like Southern California, engineers have discovered that in order to keep a building from falling down in an earthquake, what you want to do is make the foundation flexible. So they'll put all kinds of spring systems and rubber in the foundations and this kind of stuff so that when the thing starts rocking and rolling, the foundation can wiggle around and the whole building doesn't have to go with it. Okay? This is one of the highest earthquake-prone areas in the earth. This is the Dead Sea Rift where the Asian and African plate meet. And so super heavy earthquake area. They put wooden beams in the foundation of their building to give it flexibility. So they understood this way back then. So here's what the archaeologists at Tel Rehov said. They have red, slipped, hand-burnished pottery found in 2 different strata spanning multiple subphases. And they have a destruction layer separating the 2, probably the Shishak attack. So notice they have red, slipped, hand-burnished pottery beneath the Shishak attack, and more red slipped hand burnished and then also wheel burnished pottery on top. So their argument is that since you have the same pottery in both, that pottery simply lasted a long time. They kept using hand burnished pottery along with wheel burnished pottery during this period of time. Finkelstein argues that the hand burnished pottery only dates from Jezreel in the last half of the 9th century, and he's saying no, it's quite a bit earlier in our site. And he also makes an argument about the stratification. There's simply not enough time if you go with Finkelstein's revised dating. What do we see of Jerusalem in David's time? Here you are looking at the modern city. This area was the ancient city of David. Of course, you see where Jerusalem is. Here's an artist's depiction of what it looked like. Here's some of the oldest evidence that we have available. The problem with Jerusalem is that people have continuously rebuilt the city for centuries. The result of that is they're constantly destroying archaeology. And they've been doing it for centuries. Moreover, people own the land. And people tend to be rather shy about archaeologists mucking around in their basement. So for that reason, not much archaeology has happened in Jerusalem. It can't. Every once in a while, the Israeli Antiquities Authority gets lucky and a building is destroyed, or they are able to purchase it or something, and they're able to do a little excavation. But there's really not that much in Jerusalem except right around the temple area. This is just south of the temple area. And what you are seeing is called the Ophel excavations. And it was basically probably the retaining wall area that predated the time of King David. This structure was the retaining wall. It's holding up the side of the mountain. And that is all pre-David. Okay, that's the Jebusite city. This stuff probably was built around the time of King David. But there's some debate about that. So here's the recent archaeologist made this drawing. So the brown stuff is before David took the city. Blue stuff is around the time of David, and then purple stuff is later. Here I can put the two together and you can see them. When you go, by the way, they've just totally changed this area as far as visitor access, and it's really cool. The Israeli Antiquities Authority is a class organization, and they just built this archaeological park there. And so when you come in, you enter this big suspended deck area, real nice place to hang out. And then when you go downstairs, you come up on this area and some other areas I'll show you. And then you continue going down into the water system and down into Hezekiah's tunnel and through Hezekiah's tunnel. So, and I'll show you all these things over time. Here's the descent down into the water system. And here's a really interesting piece of evidence that was discovered along there by an archaeologist by the name of Warren. So we call it Warren's Shaft. One of the great challenges for ancient people, as I told you, if you're going to put a wall up, you got to have a good city gate that's going to protect you, but you also have to take care of water. Before David's time, the Jebusites who lived here, the Canaanites, they were really ingenious when it came to handling water. They had this big spring at the foot of the hill, but of course it's outside the wall. How do you get to the water inside the wall and not let the enemy get to it? So what they did was they buried it, they dug this tunnel down, and there's this shaft which is partly natural and partly excavated, and they could lower a bucket down the shaft and get to the spring in that way. If you read your books of Samuel carefully, you might remember that when David was laying siege to the city of Jerusalem, he couldn't get in, and he was being mocked by the people of Jebus because it was such a well-fortified city. And then Joab figured out a way to get into the water system. Somehow he found a way into the water system, and he was able to get inside the city and then open up the city gates so David could come in. Is this how Joab got in? Maybe. It may just be. The archaeologist Warren, when he found it, he was kind of an overweight dude. And he said, I won't believe Joab got up this shaft unless somebody can teach me to climb up this shaft myself. And so he hired some professional rock climbers, and they taught him chimney techniques and whatever, and he climbed up the shafts, and when he got up to the top, he said, okay, maybe. Maybe. So maybe that is how Joab got in. We don't know for sure, but anyhow, very cool piece. By the way, when you go to Jerusalem, and you must go to Jerusalem, when you go visit Jerusalem, go check out Warren's Shaft and this whole area. It's very cool. And when you look down Warren Shaft down toward the bottom, if you wouldn't mind, my glasses are down there. If you my sunglasses, you can pick them up for me. Here's the spring that feeds that area under Warren Shaft, and eventually was excavated into Hezekiah's tunnel, which we'll talk about later. Now here's the big new discovery. This is just about 6 years ago. Eilat Matzar, famous Israeli archaeologist from a family of famous Israeli archaeologists, made this discovery. So right on top, let me go back. So we see this Ophel excavation, and right on the top of this retaining wall, right there, just a few feet up there, she was able to get an opportunity to excavate. And what she found has changed the story forever. This is what she found. What she found was monumental architecture. She found this huge, that's her, by the way, this little tiny person. That's her. So you can see how big this building is. She's just got a little small piece of it, but you can see the size of these walls and just how grand this whole thing is. Okay, see there's Eilat Matzar there, so you can see how big this thing is. This is monumental architecture. This is a palace. And this is interesting. The foundation trenches of the walls here date to a little bit before David. But then pottery on the floor dates from the time of David, 10th century. So what that means is probably David took over this Canaanite palace and remodeled it. Right? So David's palace was more a remodel job, which might explain that strange thing. Why did David build a palace and then Solomon build a palace? Well, David was remodeling the one that was there before. Solomon probably decided to get a fresh start and do his thing. But in any case, what we have here is 10th century BC monumental architecture. And very probably most people seem to be, is there still a debate whether this is David's palace, but whatever it is, it's monumental architecture. And so you see some pieces of it and a little bit of David here keeping an eye on things. And you can see the teams at work and how big this thing is. And also a fancy capital on the right for a column that was found in the excavation. Now what about the temple? Temple's monumental architecture. What about that? Well, the problem with that is we don't have anything from the temple. Or maybe we do. Okay, so here we are looking from the west toward the east at the modern Temple Mount, what they call Sharm al-Sharif, the Muslim holy site of the Dome of the Rock. And what we are looking at is the stairway that's right here, this little stairway that goes up and into here. So you can see this whole area, this whole platform is a great big rectangle. And then you have this stairway. So this whole area is a big rectangle, and you have this stairway going up here. The whole architectural plan is rectangular, everything except that stairway. It doesn't fit. So look at the stairway. This is what it looks like at the bottom of it. And you can see the limestone steps going up. Now if you look off in the distance, up here, you can see the rest of the plan, the whole architecture of the area, goes on a rectangle that's in line with this wall. So it should go out like this. But instead, this stairway turns and it goes on an angle. You get this funny angle. You see that? Okay, so it's supposed to, the rest of the architecture of the area is on line with this wall. So this wall should continue out here. But instead, it turns and goes on a funny angle. Moreover, look at the steps themselves. All the steps except the bottom one you can see are rather fresh Jerusalem limestone going up. But the bottom step is wider, a different color, very much more worn. What's going on? What's going on is that bottom step may well be the lone piece visible remaining of the retaining wall of King Solomon's temple. Now the problem is you can't excavate there. There's an international agreement. The Muslim Religious Authority controls that area and nobody's allowed to excavate. So until you can get down and dig down, which will be a long ways down, to be able to get to the foundation of that wall, you can't check it. And that is not going to happen anytime soon. Now, if you flip around and look at the other side, now we are looking from east to west. we're looking at the retaining wall on the other side. Now, this retaining wall has been built and rebuilt by Turks and Romans and all kinds of other people. But look carefully and you'll see something interesting. Right along here, you will see a straight seam. Okay? Right along here, you will see a straight seam. And you can see that the stones on one side, the resolution is kind of goofed up, isn't it? The stones on one side and the stones on the other side are not the same kind of stones. When you build a brick wall, you build the bricks overlapping each other. But if you want to add on to the wall and you reach the corner and you want to add on to it, the new bricks are going to butt up against the old bricks and you're going to have a straight seam. That's what's going on here. You have an addition being added onto the wall. And by the way, these stones to the left are the kind of stones done by King Herod in the time of Jesus, or just before the time of Jesus. So this was an addition around the time of Jesus by the straight seam. Now here's a map of it, and you can see here's the straight seam. So here's the addition by Herod. Back on the other side, just at the edge of this picture, the wall, which was going straight, all of a sudden turns a little bit on an angle, and the rest of it goes off on an angle. Okay, just about 2 degrees. So you have a straight seam, and then you have a bend where the wall turns. It so happens that where this wall turns and sets a new angle, here, I'll have to show you a picture. I'm a really bad artist, so let's see what happens here. What? Oh, that's all right. All right, so the wall on the east side goes like this and then bends on an angle like that, okay? The other side goes like this, and the whole thing goes rectangular. So this hole is a rectangle until it gets right to that stairway, and then the stairway goes like this. Okay? This line is parallel to that line. So that's why it appears that there was an older rectangle going on, right? A rectangle that fit with this, right? That's not a very good looking rectangle, is it? Anyhow, you get the idea. That this remodeling has also changed the shape of the whole top of the plaza. So what's going on? What's going on is the stair, that one bottom stair that we saw on the other side, and this, after you get the bend in the wall, everything north of that, that's on the line of the original Temple Mount. If that's true, then the original Temple Mount was the yellow here in this drawing. So this is how it was. Green is how it was in Jesus' time. The yellow is the original part on the slightly different angle. Okay? And so on the right, then you see it probably as it was in Solomon's time. Just that smaller yellow platform. And here's the building of the temple as described in the Bible with the bronze columns out front, etc. We'll talk more about the temple in a little while. Here's a view from the south. One other really interesting piece of evidence, this was found about 12 years ago, way up in Tel Dan. This is an Aramaic inscription done by a king of the Arameans. It is a King Hazael, and he writes, I killed Joram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, and I killed Ahaziah, son of Jehoram, king of the house of David. So here's a foreign king, a little over 100 years, about 150 years after David. He's writing an inscription saying, like they all do, right? Here's the people I beat up. And he puts this thing out and he says, I beat this king in the north, and I beat King Ahaz in the south. King Ahaz was from the house of David. Beit David, house of David. What does that tell us? It tells us that a foreign king who is a neighbor to the Hebrews knows that there was a historical David. And not only that there was a historical David, that he founded a dynasty, and the guy who became the enemy to Hazael, namely Ahaz, is from that family. He recognizes the house of David. That's very, very good evidence. So when we put all these pieces together, and go back to the question of the 10th century, and by the way, almost all the archaeologists in the room agreed, there's a very high probability now, in fact, it's very difficult to suggest, even to hint, that David was a fictional character. There probably was a historical David, and if there was a historical David, there probably was a historical Solomon, and probably David was capable of doing monumental architecture, at least to the point of doing his own palace, which is what the Bible says, and that Solomon was definitely capable of doing monumental architecture, so that even though our evidence from the temple is not great, we have some hints at least of it, but we do have evidence from the city gates, precisely those same places that the Bible talked about as places where Solomon was engaged in significant building. So when you put all those pieces together, it appears that the problem of the 10th century may not be entirely solved, but we're in pretty good shape at this point, and it's pretty hard for anybody to believe anymore that David and Solomon were either fictional characters or even historical characters, but relatively weak. They did at least have the capacity to do monumental architecture. So there you have it. The problem of the 10th century. Now, do you all have a headache? It's complicated stuff. By the way, yes?
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
The way it is now with Dome of the Rock complex, is that the same specifications of Herod's temple? Because I know it was destroyed and rebuilt. Is it the same size, or is that even bigger?
Not exactly the same, and there's debates about this, but you can reconstruct Herod's temple very well, at least the external walls, because of the remains that are there. We have a lot of the original Herodian stones still there. So where I showed you the green, so what you see in the green outline there, that's really solid. We know we have that outline really well. Of course, exactly how it looked on top, we don't, because it was not, the Romans destroyed it, and then the Muslims came along in the 8th century and built the Dome of the Rock complex, and eventually the Al-Aqsa Mosque and all of that. It is reasonably probable, because of the nature of the mountain itself. If you go inside anybody ever been there, Jerusalem? Anybody been inside the Dome of the Rock? Oh, it's so cool. It's a gorgeous building. Inside the Dome of the Rock is a rock. In Muslim tradition, the rock is the place where Muhammad left his footprint when he was taken up into heaven. Okay? So, and traditionally, in Jewish tradition, it's the rock where Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac. Okay? So, and it is bedrock. The rock is the top of a mountain. So the platform is kind of built around the top of a mountain, but it's bedrock. That rock has a kind of a shelf cut out of it, and that many scholars believe that shelf was the Holy of Holies. That's where the ark sat. So that would have been the Holy of Holies in the temple in Jerusalem, and then you'd get your orientation based upon that going to the east. Does that make sense? So, in other words, you're pretty solid because you're dealing with bedrock here, and bedrock that's been covered over centuries. Yeah. Yeah.
How did the Muslims get a hold of it?
Wow. I do a whole lecture on this. Let's see. You want the whole lecture? Hey, here we go. No. Actually, we will have a Q&A time. We can talk about that maybe even Friday. But simple answer is Jews rebelled against the Roman Empire twice, 66 to 73 and 132 to 135 AD. After the second rebellion, after the first rebellion, the Romans destroyed the temple. After the second rebellion, the Romans expelled Jews from Jerusalem. This is what we call the Great Diaspora, so Jews are dispersed outward. Now, of course, some came back, but not that many. So the Romans controlled the area for a while. When Islam came on the scene, especially 632 AD was when Muhammad died. Shortly thereafter, Islam rapidly expanded, both westward across North Africa and northward throughout the Middle East. So Arabs who always lived in the area started to expand outward. And because of this tradition of Muhammad being in Jerusalem, I don't know if you know much about Islam, but Islam considers the Old Testament and New Testament sacred scriptures and holds the the patriarchs and the prophets, etc., to all be saints and prophets and so on. So because of this, Jerusalem is sacred to Muslims and always has been, and that spot is sacred because of Muhammad having the tradition of Muhammad ascending to heaven there. So the Muslims rather easily, because it was a period of weakness for the Eastern Roman Empire at the time, the Eastern Roman Empire and the Persian Empire kind of fought to a standstill and kind of wiped each other out. And so it was rather easy actually for the Muslims as they expanded to step into that power vacuum and take over the area. So when they did that, fairly shortly thereafter, then they built the Dome of the Rock, the first version of the Dome of the Rock. So that's the simple story. It's a little more complicated than that. Yeah.
Did any of the Jews who were still there, did they convert to Islam or intermarry, you think?
Without doubt. I'm sure that plenty of that happened. We certainly have evidence of it happening in Arabia. And you probably got vice versa going on too, but that stuff isn't talked about very much. And by the way, we're talking about a period of 7th century AD, 8th, 9th century AD is a time of super low literacy, not many people writing. And so while we did have rich evidence during the Roman Empire, when you get to that period, your evidence is super weak. So those stories we'd love to know about what were the relations like, generally speaking, again, this isn't a course in Islam, but if you know anything about Islam, the Quran considers Christians and Jews to be people of the book. They are sacred and holy and to be treated well and tolerated with respect. If you're Muslim, you're not to convert, right? That's not okay. You can't convert to Christianity or Judaism officially. But so because of that, when Islam expanded, so long as people didn't fight against them, very often they did, but if people didn't fight against them, then they absorbed Christians and Jews quite readily. And Christians and Jews thrived for a long, hundreds of years under Muslim rule in the various areas where they conquered. But I would say that intermarriage would have been frowned upon, and certainly conversion away from Islam was frowned upon. But conversion, of course, to Islam was encouraged. Jews and Christians also got extra tax burden, right? They get to pay extra taxes for the privilege.
So the reason I ask is I wonder if some of the ethnic heritage in the Jewish tradition that we consider Jewish land, if Jews, some of those converted to Islam, then I wonder about, because obviously this is, Islam claims the Temple on the Mount as their own, and I'm wondering if a lot of Jews converted to Islam because of the hostile nature of the Islamic takeover, or because of a lot of the Jews converting, I wonder how much of that inheritance is actually passed on to, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know at all. And you're using the term a lot of, and I don't know of any of, conversions. I mean, typically in any such social environment, you get conversions going both ways. It's just having evidence that would give you any way of seeing what the nature of it was or the quantity. I would imagine that there were some, but it's really speculation on my part. So by international agreement now, the Muslim Authority, the Waqf they call it, has control over the temple. So Jerusalem is in Jewish hands. It's part of Israel, but the Waqf Authority officially has control over the mount there. And that works out okay, sort of, but it's really difficult because the holiest site in the Jewish world is beneath the third holiest site in the Muslim world. And because it's easier to throw things down than up, that makes the Jews who go to the Western Wall feel vulnerable naturally. And so it's some of the tightest security in the world, which creates all kinds of challenges. Because if you're a Muslim and you want to go to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Iraq, to worship, you have to go through Israeli soldier security first, which, as you can imagine, isn't the most popular thing in the world. Yeah.
Can non-Muslims go in there? How?
Go where?
Inside the rock?
Oh, yes, yes. Now, generally speaking, Jews won't, because, well, part of it's a nationalist thing, but religious Jews are concerned. They don't want to be in the place where they're not supposed to be. the Holy of Holies or the, even close, right? So Jews in general avoid it. But non-Muslims are welcome. The Muslims welcome anybody. You can go in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. You can go in the Dome of the Rock. You even can get permission to go underneath the Al-Aqsa Mosque to what was the original entryway from the time of Jesus into the Temple Mount. It's a very cool area called Solomon's Stables. You might have heard of it. I've only gotten to go there once, and I had to go to the Muslim Authority. I just walked in there one day. I tried to get corresponding with them by mail, and they didn't respond to me. So when I got in town, I had a tour group with me, and so I sent the tour group off to do something else, and I went to the Muslim Waqf Authority. I just walked in, and I want to talk to somebody about taking my group down to the excavations underneath, and they said, "Oh, you need to talk to Abdul." I said, "Cool, okay, Abdul. I want to talk to Abdul." They said, "Good, you wait." Now, this very Muslim thing to do is you wait, and wait, and wait, because it kind of shows who's boss, And so I wait. Eventually, Abdul calls me in, and he says, "You want to go? You archaeologists, you want to go down? We go. Oh, this is good. You go. You go now." And he signs me a piece of paper. And so I thought, cool, and I called up my group and I said, "Okay, we're going. We can come right away." And I went over to the guards at the Temple Mount. There's Jewish guards you go through first, and then you got the Muslim guards you go through. And so I go up to the Muslim guards and I handed them the piece of paper, and they looked at me and they said, "You know Abdul? Abdul, he's a very important man, Abdul. You know Abdul? You are a friend. Come, we must have coffee. This is very important. You must have coffee." So we sit down, we have coffee, and then I'm their best friend, and it's like, everybody's showing me around. It's great time. So that was great fun. I got to take my group down, and so Abdul, he's the man. Just know. So you can do that. I just walked in and talked to Abdul, and so, yeah, it's possible, but I haven't been able to do it since. One of these days, maybe I'll try to pull it off again. They wouldn't let me take any pictures. I was kind of bummed about that, but anyhow. Well, it's time for a break, isn't it? Let's have a break, and then we'll be back. What is it, 15 minutes normally? 15 minutes, so whatever that is, 10:35.